Hi, I'm Eka Kapiotis, and I'm here on behalf of the Front Royal Women's Resource Center. And I am really thrilled tonight to have a guest, Dr. James Gillispie, also known as Dr. J. And we're going to be talking about something really important these days. Well, it's always been important, but something that's really good to know about that seems to be somewhat a mysterious thing to a lot of us on how it really does operate. So I'm very grateful to him for taking his time to be with us tonight. And I would like to say first that I am here on behalf of the Front Royal Women's Resource Center. It's a wonderful organization. Please check out our website, frwrc.org, and our Facebook page, which is also FRWRC. And I hope you will find out more about what we do. We have a lot of fun doing it, and love to have new members. So please join us. And now I'd like to again thank also known as Dr. J. So thank you, Dr. J, for being here tonight. And you are the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, but you're also a historian, and you're here from Lord Fairfax, so welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And you're right. This is very, very topical. And it's something that I find a lot of people don't know a lot about. And, I couldn't get into the nitty gritty details of the entire history of it. But yeah, it is something that I think everybody needs to know a little bit about how it works and, some of the arguments about, why maybe it doesn't work and maybe we need to amend it or abolish it, or do we need to keep it? Is it actually doing good things? So, there's a lot of confusion about it.
Well, I tell you what, why don't we just start with basics? And I know that most of us have heard of the Electoral College if we're paying any attention to the news, but what is it exactly?
Well, it wasn't really called that specifically when we first started out. The Electoral College, referring to it that way, really doesn't start to get into the everyday usage until about the 1840s. But when we were put together our country and we've got the Constitutional Convention and we're setting up the government and how it's going to work, the question came up. So we have this chief executive, but how are we going to choose that executive? And there were a number of options you could have chosen. And of course, a lot of people think now, well, why didn't we just do popular vote? Because we're all about democracy. And why didn't we do popular vote and just let the people decide who would be the president? And you have to put yourself back in the 18th century. And to most people, that was considered a supremely bad idea. We were not really all that enamored of democracy, to be quite honest. We were a republic, not a democracy, and we have representative democracy. But the idea of giving tremendous amount of raw political power directly to the people was just considered a bad idea. Most people thought, for various reasons, people were not able to exercise really sound judgments on very, very important, complex issues. So it was best to have an indirect input from the people. So, the only thing we elected directly was the House of Representatives. We didn't elect the Senate until the 17th Amendment, and that wasn't until the 20th century. So
Wow.
The idea of popular vote, that just wasn't on the table at all. So we're like, the people are too remote. They can't make good decisions. We're going to have another way of getting there. But then how do we do that? Do we let Congress decide? Well, don't want to do that, because then you have the two big branches of government. They get a little cozy that way. If the Congress is determining who's going to be the president, there might be some undue influence there. So we can't have that. So they kind of came up with this elector system where initially the judiciaries would choose people who would come in and the people would vote, but the electors would come in and they would, because they were judicious men, they would exercise sound judgment and look at the candidate's qualifications and make a good, sound, reasoned decision. Now, this was all before political parties started and all of these other things kind of came in and intruded on that model. But that's where it started, was the idea that we didn't want the people doing it. We didn't want Congress doing it. So we have this kind of indirect system where the people have something of a say, but we're still going to leave it up to, better people who are better informed. So
and of course, they're all white.
Absolutely.
and they're all men.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the way it was.
Yeah. And so So, okay, so we know something about how it started. And why does it persist then? Why do we still have it?
Well, I think part of it is because it is that elector system is written into the Constitution. The only thing it's going whatever to get rid of it, you would have to go through the amendment process, which is extraordinarily cumbersome and difficult to actually do. But for a long time, I think, really until very recently, a lot of people haven't really, I don't think, questioned whether it was working. It seemed for a good bit of our history, before 2000, we'd only had two elections really where the minority candidate actually went to the White House. So more often than
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, and two of those, and one of those you could have expected. One was 1877, and there was all kinds of problems with the end of Reconstruction, a lot of corruption, a lot of problems with vote counting and things like that. So
Mm.
people just kind of said, well, that was kind of an anomaly. They said most of the time it seems to work okay. It's clean, it works, it is what the founders had in mind. And a lot of people have this kind of almost blind faith in whatever was done in 1789 must never be taken away. You must never change that. Like landscapes don't change, times don't change. But some people just have that, respect for the past, sort of
Yeah.
thing, which I do too. I'm a historian, but
Mm. Well, actually, one of our members from the Front Royal Women's Resource Center, Lee Meyer, said that there was over last week there was an article in the Wall Street Journal, and they were talking about the Electoral College, and apparently in that article they mentioned that 900 times there has been legislation introduced to do something to change the Electoral College. That's a lot.
it is, and it's really gained a lot of traction. I mean, there was a lot of things, of course, changing in the 1960s, and it seemed like everything in that era was up for debate, up for examination, up for revision, and the Electoral College was no different. The 68 election was really, really close by the popular vote. But if you looked at the electoral numbers, because of the way the system is set up, it really tends to overrepresent some of the smaller, less populous areas, which was by design. The smaller states at the Constitutional Convention didn't want to get run roughshod over by the big states, and rural people didn't want to get run over by people living in the cities. So they tried to make this a portion so that those outlying districts would have a viable voice. And so that made sense at that time. But the way it's worked over time, like that 68 election, Nixon only had like 500,000 more votes total than Humphrey did. But the Electoral College returns were something like 301 to 191. It looked like Nixon beat his brains in, but he didn't. Not by a long shot. I mean, it was a very, very close election, but it wasn't reflected in the Electoral College. And so that Congress that met from 69 to 71 tried very hard to significantly amend the way the Electoral College was going to work to make it more reflective of the popular will. And it ran into opposition, and they filibustered it in the Senate, and it just didn't go anywhere. It came close, but it didn't go anywhere. But that whole thing kind of got things started, and people were really, and a lot of the opinion polls of the times, and really since then, have shown that most Americans do favor either significantly amending it or abolishing it altogether. The Carter administration, that was one of the things that Carter urged Congress to do, was to pass an amendment and get it going to abolish the Electoral College in favor of a pure popular vote. It didn't go anywhere, but that was one of the things he urged. And it's been, like you say, it comes up a lot. Committees are working on it right now. But it's, the way the bureaucracy in Washington works, the right people have to be on the right committees in order to get things actually to the floor. And, if one group really doesn't want it to happen, and they happen to have enough votes on those committees or have control to that kind of access, then it doesn't happen. And unfortunately, that's kind of what's happened. But right now, there's still, for the last 50 years or more, there's been popular support for doing something about this.
So, and I can certainly see why, especially in the last, and we'll circle back around to that. But I have a couple questions, and one is how, I'll just say both of them now. Who are these people? And how are they chosen? And how is it decided how many electors a state has?
Well, it initially was the state legislatures would choose the electors, but for the longest time now, I couldn't tell you exactly when it started uniformly, but now and for a long, long time, it's always been the political parties they choose their electors, and then they pledge themselves to, if the votes in this state are 51% for this party, that's who they will cast their votes for. So that's why a lot of times you'll see they never say that the president's elected or this state like Florida elected this person or North Carolina elected this person. It's like the votes were awarded, because technically that's really what happened, because they're not elected at all. It's these electors award their votes to the person who gets the most votes in that state. And that's how they're chosen. And the number of votes that any state has is based on the total number of congressmen they have. So you look at that and they make that by population. So everybody gets, because of the Senate, everybody gets two. So it's a combination of population and state. Is that old Federalist sort of look.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so if more than 50% of a state votes for one candidate, then the entire state goes to that candidate.
Yeah, that's when they refer to that winner take all model.
Yeah.
And it's not, well, I take that back. It is legislated in 30 some states that's the way it has to be. But in most other states, it's simply the expectation. In fact, if you break ranks with that, they call you a faithless elector, which means, and you will not be appointed by your party to ever be an elector again. And if you happen to be in a state that legislates that you must cast your vote for the majority vote getter, then they can take your vote and change it. In fact, there were 10 electors in the 2016 election that they did try to go ahead and cast their vote the other way, and their state said that's illegal. You can't do that in this state. And there have been people who have done that. There have been people who have broken ranks over the years. None of them have ever really affected the outcome of an election. But no, it's expected. It's just been that way between tradition and law. That's the way it works. So, which has been one of the big criticisms of the way the system works.
Well, and I seem to recall that after the last election, I heard some things on the news about certain states were trying to change how their states could, how the electors would award in those states. So it's actually, even though it's in the Constitution, that this exists, each state has a say in how they manage it or how they do it.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, most states do it kind of like that winner take all, and they just count up the votes, and whoever gets 51%, they just give them all that way. But and now I'm blanking on the two. I think Maine is one of them. But there's two states that do it they go by congressional district and award the electors that way. But you could conceivably, like I said, there's an electoral system, but it doesn't really spell out exactly how it must work. That's up to the states. So you could conceivably have a situation where a state could decide to say that we're using the electoral system, but we're going to perhaps divvy it out based on proportion of the vote. So if it comes down 51-49 and you've got a state with 15 electoral votes, then you go 8-1 and 7 to the other, because that's more some would argue, a more accurate reflection of the views and feelings of the people of that state. So that's not out of the realm of possibility. It just takes a tremendous amount of having the right people in office and the right, I guess, momentum to make that happen, but it could. And so some states don't really, like I said, they don't require you. There's no legal requirement to do it this way. It has to be that way in the Constitution, but it's the way it's written in most of the states.
Okay. So that again makes the census very important because how many Congress people, I hope I have this right, but
Oh, yeah.
yeah, that how many representatives you have are based on the census. So is that right? So would the census impact the how many electors you have conceivably?
Oh, absolutely. That the number of, and there's all kinds. I mean, it's one of those things. We live in a great age of Googling everything. So, you can really quickly Google. And in fact, I was looking at something the other day that showed, over the last 10 or 15 years, or last 20, 25 years, actually, the how some states have grown. So some states have gotten more representatives, and therefore they've gotten more of an electoral voice. So whereas states that lose population, they could always stand to lose some of those. Although you're still always guaranteed, no matter how small you are, you always get at least three. But yeah, that's why the census is important, because if you're being left out, that affects the strength or the lack thereof of your electoral voice.
Yeah.
Providing you're in a state that's competitive. I mean, that's where you get the whole red state, blue state thing, where and why this system, in a way, I think it's been argued, and I think it probably does, it really discourages turnout, because if people are in a solidly red or blue state and they tend to vote the other way, why show up? I mean, my vote's not going to count, and because my state is so solidly this, and I'm the other thing. So why do it? And so that's been another reason people have said we need to amend this or get rid of it, because we want people to be active, we want people to be involved, we want people to vote, and they're not going to vote if they don't feel like their vote counts.
Right. And so I think that was one reason why I wanted to have this discussion, because I think that if I recall correctly, in 2000, the determination of who became president was based on less than 1,000 votes. Was it like 600?
Yeah, it was a tremendous. I mean, it was a tremendously slim margin of course, and it was mostly, it was in that state. The national difference was a little bit higher than that, but in that area, yeah, it came down to that one or two counties in Florida and getting them counted correctly, and they wound up, of course, we know the Supreme Court said, well, we're not going to count them, but yeah, in states like, because Florida is what they call a swing state, which is another criticism of the system, is that candidates just focus on these big states that are very strategically important, like a Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, like that, because again, just a handful of votes in one state, if that one state has a lot of electoral votes, that could wind up really being the deciding factor, not what the country wants, but maybe even the people in this one county in Florida could be the difference between who goes to the White House and who doesn't. And again, that's what people have been pointing out, because really it seems like over the last 45 years, we've had more elections like that where, I mean, if you do the math, although it won't work out because the states some of them are solidly red and blue, but really, if you take the right 11 states, you only have to win 11, and you could hit the right number of electoral votes to 270, I believe it is, to hit that if you get the right ones. Obviously, we're talking like New York, Texas, California, and in reality, that would never happen because some of those states are so solidly one way or the other. But it kind of brings home the point about how unrepresentative that the system could potentially be. And so if we have those kinds of potentials, maybe we have to have a serious conversation about this.
Yes, it really does seem like it's time. And like you said, that in the last 200 years or more, we only had two elections, but in the last 20 years, we've had two elections where the person who had the popular vote didn't win, and that's
Yeah.
a lot.
Well, it is when you figure, 40% of the elections in the 21st century. I mean, that's kind of a, overly dramatic way of putting it, but it's true. Two out of the five elections, the person who got the least number of votes of the two candidates wound up getting awarded the White House. And so, when you start having it happen that frequently, you start having it. I think it really brings home is this: if we really value democracy like we say we do, then why are we clinging to a system that seemed to be so undemocratic?
Yeah, and it's not like anymore that people in more. It's not like people don't have access or don't have a voice. I mean, I think that although, and oh, you know what? We were going to talk about how this also really impacted people of color and women because of the way that people were voting. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, in fact, that's been another one of the criticisms of this system that, for a long time, if you have a popular votes set up, there's more incentive to get more voters out there. But under an electoral system, it doesn't matter how many people vote because the number of electoral votes don't change. So for years, where's the incentive to give the vote to women? They never, that never occurred to people for a lot of reasons. I mean, the gender bias that was already always existed. But then, there was no political gain to any of the parties to include women because the system wasn't set up to reward making the electorate wider or broader. So it just didn't happen. And that, oddly, when it did, it kind of happened for sort of sexist reasons, really. You've just thought that, well, women aren't smart enough to be corrupt, so they'll make the electorate more pure. So, they'll vote like mom. Your mom's a good person. It's a bad thing. It's like we always celebrate that it's great that we had the 19th Amendment, but I always tell my students, I say, yeah, but the rationale was a little shaky. It was kind of the right thing for the wrong reasons, sort of thing.
Well,
But
as a woman, I'll say whatever, however we got it. Here we are. And
but it also, that whole thing about since it doesn't matter how many people show up, there have been a couple of studies that have argued that the Electoral College system kind of masks voter intimidation, and states that have, way back when we had things like poll taxes and literacy tests and things like that, nobody was counting the number of votes. And so if you see that all of a sudden that you've got this one state and you've got different populations that are almost not voting at all, well, those kind of questions don't necessarily get asked or are immediately visible when the number of electoral votes never changes, regardless of whether 2 million people voted or 500,000 people voted. It's masked by the system.
yeah, wow. And so that would have impacted not only women, but also people of color, or men of color, since once women got the vote. Well, and you were talking about how there was also in order to vote, there were at sometimes property requirements and literacy requirements. Can you say a little bit about that? Because clearly that was to suppress the vote.
Yeah, well, it's weird. We kind of went up and down in terms of opening up and then closing down. In the years leading up to the Civil War, more men were actually able to vote as the idea of expanding democracy, again, restricting it to white males. But that opened it up, and a lot of the old restrictions went away. A lot of the old property requirements went away. Then you start seeing after the Civil War, and you get the Reconstruction amendments that come up, most notably, of course, the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment said that you can't deny men the right to vote based on race, color, creed, previous condition of servitude. And this is where you start getting people like Susan B. Anthony going, wait a minute, can we insert another word into that amendment here? But so what winds up happening is the states where most of the former slaves had lived, now you have this amendment that seems to say that black men now have the right to vote. But when you dissect the language, it says no, it doesn't say who has the right to vote. It just says you can't discriminate based on these criteria. So it doesn't say anything about literacy tests, doesn't say anything about poll taxes. So it got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the 15th Amendment did not positively give anybody the right to vote. It just said that if you're going to tell a black man he can't vote, you got to come up with another reason other than his color. So like, okay, well, we'll use literacy tests or we'll use a poll tax because that requires you to have some cash. And this is a group that is overwhelmingly impoverished. They don't have spare cash. And then they wrote the laws. You had to be caught up. So if you didn't vote in one election and then you saved up your $2 to go vote in the next one, they said, well, that's great. You've got the $2 for the last election. You got $2 for this one. Well, no, I don't have $4. So it's like you had to show up with a month's salary just to vote. And that's going to disproportionately impact poor people. Who were the poorer people? They also tended to be people of color. And so there were all kinds of ways that states got around essentially disenfranchising whole groups of people that they wanted to marginalize. And it was one of the reasons that in the late 60s and early 70s, most of the I'm not trying to get political. It's just this was history. It's just what happened. But the resistance came from states like South Carolina, where there was enough of a slight white majority still that they liked the winner take all. They didn't want that to go away because in South Carolina, for example, you could essentially negate the black vote in presidential elections by simply having a slight majority. If you open that up to popular vote, suddenly this group of people that a lot of other people did not want to have this kind of political power because they felt like, well, their interests are very different from mine, so I don't want to change things. I'm benefiting from the status quo. I don't want to change it. And so that's where a lot of that resistance came from, because it was benefiting one group and at the expense of another.
Well, I have to say, I'm finding this conversation a little depressing.
Well, take heart that, I always tell people one of the things I learned from the progressive era in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is that a lot of things came out of that people just 20 years earlier would have never thought they would have seen. So, it is possible through grassroots movements. And I think between, now we have, social media can be it's like anything, it's a double-edged sword, but I think we have so many free ways to motivate people and get people organized. And if you get enough people moving in the same direction at the same time, eventually you can't ignore that.
I agree with you. And I do believe that on some, that change is happening. I really do believe that. And so what do you think? Do you think that the possibilities of the Electoral College changing in the next, 20 years? Do you think, considering what's happened in the last 20, do you think that there's a possibility that this might change? Do you think there's enough interest in having it change?
I'm optimistic. I really hope it does. And I think now, particularly in over the last 20 years, I think the arguments against changing it just don't have the same weight that they ever would have before. There's just been so much just raw data and evidence that shows that this system is not very democratic. It's not operating in a way that it's really truly representing the will of the people. And it's not about whether your guy won or your guy lost. It's about, because you may be glad that, okay, the system is messed up and it doesn't work very well, but my guy won, so I want to keep it. Well, that could just as easily work the other way. So wouldn't you rather have something that is a little more fair, a little more reflective of everybody, and something that I hope it happens, because I think one of the things that it would do is it would completely obliterate this whole red state, blue state thing. And all the candidates would have to really, from right and left, they would have to get in the middle a lot more than maybe they do now, because that's the only way you're going to win. And in a broad popular thing. And they really thought initially that the electoral system would assure that you would have, by having to pay attention to people out in the rural areas, you would have to garner broad support in order to win. But over time, that the logistics have changed. And so now you've got people just focusing on narrow pockets of people rather than really trying to have a message that is as inclusive as possible to everybody, because they don't have to. They're like, well, I've got these 7 states. I don't have to worry about them. I'm not going to go talk to them. And you see that with the way they spend their money. I mean, look, they're spending all of their money in the Pennsylvanias and then the Floridas, and then they're spending them in like 5 swing states. And so we need something that's more, I think it would benefit the people to do that. And I think the more people realize that they'll actually be better off, and it would be more the government that they deserve, and maybe it'll change.
Thank you.
Fingers crossed. I mean, maybe I'm unduly optimistic. I don't know, but I hope so.
Well, and I mean, I think that we're getting certainly a more diverse representation in our government. And, we're certainly that's been the trend, and the candidates, the current slate of candidates certainly show that. So I think that as we are represented more accurately in our government, those kinds of things can happen. So, yeah.
I think it's just a matter of, like I said, that more diverse electorate, getting more new blood into Washington. At some point, it's going to be really, really difficult to keep those folks with some new, and some of them, they're not new ideas, but they're finally getting to be able to get on committees that can actually get things done and accomplished. Because so much of that in Washington is, are you properly connected and on the right committees? And it's so hard to break into that as a freshman congressman. But as more and more are introduced in there, it's going to be harder and harder to keep those ideas out.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time. I think this is a really fascinating subject, and certainly has probably a lot more impact on our daily lives than a lot of people might even be aware of. So I really, really appreciate you taking your time to talk with us about that. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself, and this was a lot of fun. And if you can't think of anything else you want me to come run my mouth about for 30 or 40 minutes on an evening, I'll be happy to do that. I had a good time. Thank you.
And I would also like to invite anyone to add any questions that you have. The video will have, there are places that you can comment. So if anyone has any questions and you'd like to send them to Dr. J, he's been very responsive in terms of, just answering any questions that we have. So if anyone has any other questions that they'd like to have answered, please feel free to comment. Please feel free to check out FRWRC, and don't forget to vote. Don't forget to get yourself registered. And so, Dr. James Gillispie, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Eka. I appreciate it. I had a good time.
Great. And so the next several woman gatherings, the one in September and October, we will be exploring other points about the election. I feel that it's really, affects so profoundly how we live, who is in office. And so we want to make sure that what Dr. J is talking about, people feeling like their votes don't matter, to make sure that does not happen this time. And I do think that your vote does matter, even if you are in a so-called red or blue state. So we're going to do our best to encourage people to get out there and vote. And thank you again. Thank you, all of you, for watching. And thank you, Jen Avery. You want to pop in and say ta-ta? Jen is our technology with...
Hi, everybody. Where am I? That way. Hi.
Oh, thank you, Jen. Okay, good night, everyone. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.